Good afternoon, everyone. We try to do our best here to start on time. We said that we would be starting at 1:30 and we're going to get started. So thank you all for registering for our webinar today, talking about the cost of living in rural Minnesota. We're very excited to have you all with us today. We have over 100 people registered, which, you know, we've been really pleasantly surprised by the webinars we've hosted the last few months and how many people we've had register. We figured that maybe in July that there wouldn't be nearly as many people registering just because it's summer and people are out and about, but that's not the case. We have a great group today, so I'm very excited. We're going to get started here, and Kelly, I'll ask you to put up the introductory slides and we'll get going, but while we're doing that, what we're going to be doing today is we'll be hearing from Kelly Ash with the Center for Rural Policy and Development, and he'll be going through his data and research that we're just releasing today. You guys are the first ones to see it. And then we'll hear from Ben Winchester from the University of Minnesota Extension, and he'll be talking about some research that they're doing as well. And then after that, we'll have a time for questions. So we do ask that if you do have questions throughout, that you just go into the chat feature and you can type in those questions, and Marnie on our staff is moderating that. So like I said, if you have questions throughout, just put those in chat and Marnie will be taking care of those. So the way that we'll structure the time is, like I said, we'll be starting with Kelly, and then we'll be going to Ben, and then we'll be doing questions at the end. So thank you all for coming. Kelly, you can advance to the next slide. I want to kind of give you a
little bit of technical glitch here, Julie. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Apologize.
Okay. Sure. So let me just give you guys all just a brief background on how we came to this research topic. Working with Tim Penny from this Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation, Tim and I met last year and we were discussing, you know, what is the true cost of living in Minnesota, especially in rural Minnesota, and is it better or more expensive? What are those nuances? And we knew that Deed already had a calculator for that, but what Kelly was able to do is go and extrapolate that some more. So we're really excited to share with you today that tool that you'll be able to go by county and by region and find out what exactly the average cost of living is in your area. And so that's all part of our atlas that we do every year. So we have 5 parts of our Minnesota Atlas that is live now, actually. You'll be able to go in there and see, gosh, I can't even tell you all of the research that we have up there. But then also today we are releasing our State of Rural. And every year the state legislature, we're mandated by the state legislature to do a state of rural, kind of what's going on, what is the status of rural right now in Minnesota. And obviously right now, across the country and across the world, things are really interesting times right now. But in rural Minnesota, especially whether it's in manufacturing and agriculture, tourism with COVID, interesting times. And so that is live right now as well as our State of Rural. So you'll be able to go in there and find some statistics and talking just about that. Also wanted to mention, I know several of you on this call are new to our organization, so thank you for finding us, and thank you to the media for being on here as well. I know many of you are new here as well. Give you a quick background while we're getting our technology figured out. The Center for Rural Policy and Development, we were created in 1997 by the state legislature, actually, and we were created to look at issues in rural Minnesota. When we're looking at issues and policies in Minnesota overall at the legislature or at any level, you know, you kind of look at almost as a one size fits all, but we know in rural Minnesota that it's not a one size fits all. And so when we were created, we have a board of up to 20 people. Right now we have 19. But what we were created is to put that rural lens on policy. So when we're looking at healthcare, you know, obviously healthcare is very important, and we're trying to figure out the best avenue for healthcare, and rural healthcare especially. Rural healthcare looks different than it does in the Twin Cities metro area. So that's why we were created. Every year we do a research agenda, and we ask for, what we ask for are ideas, and we ask people to rank research ideas that are important out in rural Minnesota. And so this year we just actually released our research agenda, and of course COVID-related topics are very much at the top of that. But we're doing literature reviews right now, and we'll be starting to get things going here in the fall. Okay, Kelly. Our staff and board, we're a small shop. It's myself as president and CEO. Then we have Marnie Werner, who's our director of research and our VP of operations. And then Kelly Ash is our research associate. And like I said before, we do have a board of directors. Most of them are appointed by the governor. Then we also have 2 appointed by the House and the Senate leadership, and then 5 at large. And it's great because our board represents various aspects of greater Minnesota, whether that's diversity of place or space or ethnicity of thought. Very happy with our board. We have a great board, so we're very excited about that. And then wanted to mention before I turn it over, if you are not receiving our information, please sign up. Please go to our website at ruralmn.org. We did a refresh of our website this past year, and we're very excited that we're doing that. And we're also fine-tuning our search feature because we have 20 years worth of research and data, and so we want that to be available for all of you. And so we're really modifying how that looks and what that looks like on our website. Also, we have a YouTube channel that is new within just the last few months. So several of our research topics have a video with them. So our most recent video actually is on rural healthcare. So you can go to our YouTube channel and check out our videos right there. And we're going to be doing one on cost of living as well. And then finally, we do have a new website or a new podcast as well called The Center of Everywhere. And right now you can go to our website at ruralmn.org and click on that to listen. We have about 5 episodes up, and we're working on some more, and it should be coming soon on iTunes. So we're very excited about that. One last thing, again, if you aren't receiving our newsletter, we send it out about every 4 to 6 weeks. If you're not receiving that, please go to our website, and there will be a pop-up, and there's also an area that you can register for our website, or for our newsletter, I'm sorry. So very excited about that. We just reached the 600 subscriber mark, so we're very excited about that. We just started it late last year. With that, I believe, Kelly, we're playing technology here. All right, Kelly, you good?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, everybody. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. My name's Kelly Ash, Research Associate. I'm the one that kind of dug a little bit into the cost of living and wages. And today you're going to be hearing a little bit about some of the information that we kind of gathered for this piece, as well as from Ben Winchester, which from the University of Minnesota Extension, Center for Community Vitality, who's done a lot of work around people recruitment, working with communities on the ground and how to promote themselves. And many times the cost of living kind of creeps into the conversation many times when folks are promoting themselves. Julie, if you could give me a thumbs up, is the presentation on the screen and looking good? Okay, great, thank you. So, oh shoot, you know what? I shared the wrong one here. Sorry about that, everybody. Let's try this again. Play from start. We'll use a slideshow. Okay, so wages can go further in greater Minnesota. So let's talk a little bit about this and how we come up with this. Here was our research question when we first started out. How competitive are wages in greater Minnesota when considering or taking into account the cost of living? So this is really connected to some research that we've done over the past couple of years looking at job vacancies in greater Minnesota. And so we did a 4-part series looking at all the job vacancies. And as many of you on this webinar and watching this later on already know, is that rural areas are seeing a significant number of job vacancies, due to two main things: demographic changes. So you got a lot of people retiring, not as many people entering the workforce, but you also have economic growth in these regions. And so for all of those, and you can see in this chart on the left, that's just kind of a trend line of all of the quarterly job vacancies as a percentage of the total filled jobs in each planning region. The red line is actually the 7-county metro, and you can see that's at 4.65%, but all of our other regions outside of the 7-county metro actually have a higher percentage of job vacancies as a percentage of their total jobs. That just essentially says there's high demand for people to fill jobs. Our research showed that job vacancies are at all-time highs. All occupations are experiencing high levels of vacancy. I know some folks are like, well, these are all, low-paying jobs, but that's really not the case. You're seeing increases across all occupations. And one interesting thing to note is that median wages for these job vacancies are actually increasing faster in greater Minnesota. So if you looked at median wages for job vacancies back in 2005, you would have saw a pretty big gap between 7-county metro and the rest of our planning regions. But over time that we got to 2018, the 7-county metro has stayed relatively flat as far as their median wages go for job vacancies, where all the other regions in Minnesota have increased. And so that gap has shrunk pretty significantly over the past 10 years. The other three parts of our job vacancy research then kind of dug into how do we fill some of these job vacancies? What are the populations that our rural areas are attempting to engage for our employers? And so two of them that I think cost of living really touches on is resident recruitment, which Ben and his crew talk a lot about, and then engaging high school students, local high school students, with some of the opportunities that are available to them. The other piece that we looked at in our research were folks that had high barriers to employment. These might be people with disabilities, people with criminal background history, and other types of barriers that prohibit them from participating maybe at a level that's at a rate that's equal to other populations. But again, resident recruitment high school students is where this cost of living and wages kind of plays a big role. This is one graphic I really like to use. It's from the Upper Minnesota Valley Regional Development Commission. They kind of put a graphic together about what promoting and engaging looks like when you're trying to promote your area to people that may not live there or are thinking about living in their region. You can see they want to promote housing, employment opportunities, things to do, family essentials. And when we were out in the field interviewing folks, it was just pretty common that you heard wages playing a little bit of a role in how people view and think about rural areas. And it's really this kind of, yeah, but the wages are so low. And then somebody will repeat, yeah, but the cost of living is so low. But there wasn't a ton, there's data available for these things, but no one that we saw had really put these two things together to kind of get a clear picture of like, what does this mean when you put these two things together, and what does that mean as far as competitiveness of these wages? And so that's what we attempted to do with this tool in this brief kind of research paper that we put together. Now, we can't talk too much about cost of living unless we talk a little bit about the data, because this will help define what they mean by cost of living, because otherwise we're going to get a lot of questions about what does it include this, does it include that? And so here's what it includes. And first of all, just so you know, the cost of living is actually gathered by Department of Employment and Economic Development here in Minnesota. They have their own tool on their website. You can check out their link there where you are able to check what region type you want, if you're single or partnered, one full-time worker, one part-time, et cetera, how many children. And then it gives a map of kind of what that cost of living looks like in each county across the state. And then below it, the table with yearly cost, and then the categories. How much does it cost monthly for childcare, for food, for healthcare in each of those counties? It's a very cool tool. Dee just does a really tremendous job and continues to do a great job for us in Minnesota. And I can't give them enough credit for the work that they do. So here's the categories that we use, that they use for their cost of living. Food, housing, healthcare, transportation, childcare, net taxes, and other necessities. So there's a lot within these. I highly recommend they list the methodology on the DEED website if you want further information. I'm just going to briefly go over each category here so you kind of get an idea of what it includes and doesn't include. So we'll start out with food. And so food is calculated by using the USDA food plans, the cost of food at home. It's a monthly estimate. There are 4 different types of food plans provided in that USDA tool. And DEED uses the moderate cost plan. There's like low cost plan, there's moderate, and then high, and then I forget, there's 4 of them. There's another one in between there, but this particular tool uses the moderate cost plan to calculate costs. Important to note, these costs do not include the cost of restaurant meals. Housing is actually using United States Housing and Urban Development's Fair Market Rent Survey. This survey does include the cost of utilities. Some people are kind of confused by that, but it does try to capture that monthly cost of utilities, but it does not include the cost of telephone, cable, satellite, internet. DEED tries to capture some of those expenses under their other necessities category. Healthcare. Healthcare premiums are calculated using the cost of MNsure plans across the state, while out-of-pocket expenses are calculated using data from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. For the MNsure plan, I have to reconnect with DEED. I can't remember if it was the silver plan or which one it is, but it's just taken directly from the MNsure database as far as what the monthly premium cost is for that and the out-of-pocket expenses. Transportation, these figures represent the basic cost of owning and operating a car. This includes commuting to work, conducting necessary family and personal business, and getting to and from school and places of worship. They use a bunch of different data sources to calculate this. One thing that's important to know, it does not include anything related to public transportation, and it does not use two cars, just owning and operating a single car. That can be, you know, a little bit troublesome, I think, thinking about rural areas and the cost of living. It's pretty common if two people are working that you're going to need two vehicles, but this cost of living tool doesn't take that into account. It just uses one car no matter where you live. Childcare. These figures come directly from the Child Care Aware database, which publishes average rates for each county. And the net taxes category, this includes FICA payroll tax, federal and state income tax, but it does not include property tax. That's important to know with this tool. And then the other necessities, which tries to capture like the cost of apparel, personal care products and services, reading, education, other miscellaneous items. Really what they're doing is they're taking the total cost of food and housing and taking a percentage of what that cost was. I think it's 16% if I remember right. And that essentially is the cash necessary for other necessities. Not a perfect way to calculate it, but probably the only way to calculate other necessities. And methodologically, it seems really, really good. So for the following slides I'm going to start showing cost of living and what the wages look like. This is the family composition I am using. So we're using number in household, 3 people. The number of workers is 1 full-time and 1 part-time, which is about 3,120 hours annually. 1 child, and we assume the adults are between the ages of 19 and 50. So just for what the cost of living categories look like then. So for housing, it's calculated for a 2-bedroom house. Childcare is part-time, and it averages the ages of between 0 and 12. And that's a little difficult, but it has to do that because we don't know what age a child is, and there's different costs for the age of child. So DEED averages that across the ages. And I know what some of you are saying, wow, there's part-time childcare available. One thing about the cost of living calculators to understand is that this doesn't assume that things are available. It's just taking the data for what it is, but not actually looking at actual what people and households spend or is available in each of the counties. Food, so it's a 3-person household, moderate cost plan with a child. Transportation, 1 car, travel to work, travel to purchase necessities. The other necessities is proportion of food and housing costs. It was 16%. The healthcare is one of the premiums on the MNsure market. Again, I got to follow up and try and determine which one that is. And then the taxes, they have a really calculated way, or a really sophisticated way of calculating taxes, which uses a lower bound income and an upper bound income, which is determined by what your cost of living and all the other categories is, and then essentially simulates those bounds through a model to try and figure out what your taxes would be using their models. It's pretty cool. Okay, so now we can actually get into what some of this looks like. So let's look at the differences in wages and cost of living. So this is the hourly, I'm sorry, it says monthly, it should say hourly, that was my mistake. This is the hourly cost of living, or the hourly wage needed to meet the cost of living for our family composition in each county. And you can see in the 7-county metro, we're approaching that kind of $19 to $20 an hour range to meet the cost of living. The further you go south and west and north, the less it gets. You're getting closer to that $14 to $15 an hour wage necessary to meet the cost of living. A little bit higher, as you see, if you go straight north of the 7-county metro, where it continues to be between that 16 and 18 range. The cost of living is just a little bit higher in those counties. I broke it down also by planning region because it can be a little easier to kind of visualize, I think, when we look at regions. And you can see the hourly wage needed to meet the cost of living in each of our planning regions, with 7 county, Minneapolis, St. Paul being up near that $20 range, Central at $17.46, and then going all the way down to Southwest at $15.09 an hour. So this is what the categories look like. This is the monthly cost for each cost of living category. And so each dot here represents a planning region. And you can see there's some significant differences. So such as childcare, where red, again, is semi-county metro, and then all these other dots are outside of there. You can see that they're close to $700 a month needed for childcare, where a lot of our other planning regions using the childcare aware database is significantly lower, around 400 or less per month. And that would be for part-time childcare. Food is about the same. Healthcare is actually a little bit more expensive in our greater Minnesota planning regions compared to the 7 county metro. That's just that just happens when you have more higher population density. You got insurance companies that can spread their risk around a lot more people and lower the premium costs. Housing is the biggest difference, and you'll see 7 county metro is way up in the kind of $1,250 per month range, with everybody else being below that. Taxes is the other one where you see some pretty significant differences, with 7 county metro being quite a bit higher. So just kind of reiterate, housing is one of the biggest ones, with 33% lower in greater Minnesota for the most part for housing. Childcare is about 50% lower in greater Minnesota, and taxes were about 40% lower in greater Minnesota than the 7 county metro. So what we want to do now is bring in the wages. So this is wages for occupations, and we essentially want to see, does the median wage for these occupations, is it above or below? Does it match the cost of living at all? So is it way below it, so it doesn't even make up the cost of living? Or is it over here on the right where it is above the cost of living and the median wage is sufficient? And so that's kind of what we're doing. We're taking the percentage of the cost of living. So this is an example where we used healthcare support. This is the occupation healthcare support. This is a pretty significant occupation that needs a lot of people to fill jobs over the next, well, currently today and probably over the next 15, 20 years. And this is the median wage, as well as on the chart here, what percentage that median wage makes of the cost of living. One thing you'll notice right away is it's 7 county Minneapolis, St. Paul, the median wage for healthcare support down here on the bottom is $19.51. That's higher than any other planning region. That median wage is the highest, but that only makes up essentially 100% of the cost of living there. But if we look at the Southwest, where it's $14.41, that's the median wage. That's the lowest out of all the planning regions, but it also makes up the second highest cost of living percent at 120%. Southeast makes $15.81 and makes 125% of the cost of living to live there. So this just kind of provides a little bit of a different nuance to how we look at wages and the cost of living. So when we're promoting our areas or talking about rural areas and their wage competitiveness and their community vitality or their economic vitality, you really can't just talk about wages. Cost of living does have to be a part of this. So that was just an example. Let's show a couple things that we learned. We just did a very shallow kind of look at the data. We didn't go super deep, but we just kind of wanted to put this tool together because we thought it was helpful. So 2 things that we learned, kind of what I've been talking about, wages go farther in greater Minnesota, but then we're an organization of nuance. We don't want to just say like, yep, everything's great, everything's fine. There is this issue of where the occupations are located, or I'm sorry, the concentration of occupations, how many jobs are in what types of jobs, because that's going to make a pretty big difference in whether that county's overall wages can meet the cost of living. Okay, I know this chart looks crazy, but it's easy. So this looks at the differences in wages for each occupation. Each dot is a planning region, so each color represents a planning region. And the further over, and then the chart represents its monthly median wage for that occupation. So essentially, the further the dot is over to the right, the better. And you can see for almost every single occupation, this red dot, the 7 county metro, has a higher wage than all the other planning regions for nearly every single occupation. That's not, that's not surprising. However, this is a similar chart, again, looking for the dots that go furthest right. This is looking at the monthly median wages as a percent of cost of living. And you can see now The further to the right means that that median wage in that region for that occupation makes up a larger percentage of the cost of living for that region. And you can see all of a sudden the red dot, the 7-county metro, is falling to the left of all the other dots. What this typically shows is that even though you don't want to say low wages, that the lower wages that are offered for occupations that are paid for occupations in regions outside of the 7-county metro tend to make up a larger percentage of the cost of living in that region than the higher wages do in the Twin Cities or in the 7-county metro. So it's interesting because I think it kind of, I think provides evidence for what a lot of people have been feeling is that, yeah, I'm getting paid less out here, but it just feels like things are just a little bit cheaper and it just doesn't seem quite as hard to make ends meet. And what this data shows is, yes, that's true, in particular when we look at specific occupations. But, so if you talk to either myself or Marnie, my colleague here, researcher, and I think even Ben, we're creatures of nuance. We don't want to just end it there because there's always this kind of, we'll move forward with this idea and this narrative and then get caught with this kind of like, oh, but wait, this is different. So what I ended up doing there was taking the median wage for each occupation. So service related, manufacturing, trades, doctors, we're looking at the median wage for each one of those occupations. But another way to do that is if we just want to take the median wage for that entire county. So we're throwing all of the jobs into one pool and then looking at the median wage then. And what happens is if you have a concentration of wages that are towards occupations that don't pay as well, that median wage is going to be represented to the left here. It's going to be less than if you have a higher percentage of jobs that might be more towards this side of things. And that's exactly what happens. And so this looks at each county in Minnesota. So the map on the left is the median monthly wage among all occupations. And you can see the highest monthly wage, median wages of all occupations is generally found in the 7-county metro and reaches quite a bit as you circle around there. The map on the right shows the median monthly wage. So all of these wages here as a percent of the cost of living in each of these counties. And you can see again, the Twin Cities, not quite as good, not quite as dark blue as the median monthly wage among occupations, but then the counties in the southern and southwest and northwest Minnesota all look pretty good, right? So even though they're getting paid less, they can still make up for that cost of living. But where that doesn't so much happen is where you kind of get towards north central and northeastern Minnesota, where you might be more focused on service related tourism type economy, where you have a higher percentage of those jobs that are located in those occupations that don't pay as well. And on top of that, if you remember right, the cost of living in these kind of north of the Twin Cities counties was also a little bit higher than the rest of rural Minnesota as well. And so that's where this kind of goes a little bit, it doesn't work as well for those regions or those counties when you just lump all the wages together. That's why it's important when you talk to your employers and you're talking to people that are interested in moving in, you talk to them specifically about the occupation they're interested in and not just wages on a whole, because that kind of paints a different picture. So I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to just take a real quick look at our website so everybody kind of knows where you can find the tool and all that.
So Kelly, I've got a question here. Could you clarify the hourly rate needed for the cost of living? Is that per household or per working individual? So if you have 2 workers, do they both need to make that hourly wage?
Yeah, excellent question. Yes, that's the average that the part-time and the full-time need to be working per hour. That's a great question. Let me share my screen here. I will show you real quickly. So for everybody, this is our website right here. You can find it at ruralmn.org. Scroll down below, you'll find our report down here under news, brief discussion, wages can go further in greater Minnesota. That's where you'll find the report. And then we have been talking about our atlas. If you click on that, it takes a little bit. It takes you to another website. This is an in-house created data tool that Marnie and I use for interviews. We just like having a lot of data and charts ready to go at our hands. And we decided, hey, let's just make this public so a lot of folks can see it. And we added this chapter 5, cost of living. And when you pull this up, you can either do comparison across counties and regions. So this will provide just the cost of living in each county. You can choose partnered, age of adults, and then how many children. And then you can hover over to kind of see what your hourly wage needed for cost of living is for each of those adults working, as well as the table below kind of laying out what the cost of the monthly cost for each of those categories is in each county. We also can incorporate the occupation wages here. And again, if I do partnered, age 19 to 50, children in household 1, and then you can choose what occupation you would like, and let's choose architecture and engineering. And you can see here, it provides just a real quick map of the percentage that median wage in architecture and engineering makes up of the cost of living of each county. And in this case, the greener, the better. So I guess with that, I know there's probably going to be a lot of questions. And Marnie, I know she's she's kind of gathering up some of those questions. And so we're going to hold on to those for a little bit longer. I did want Ben to talk a little bit more broadly about the survey that they have conducted and are currently doing analysis on. I thought it really tied in nicely with this cost of living, this conversation around how competitive is rural Minnesota at a time when we're all trying to promote ourselves. And so, Ben, if you want to take her away, please do.
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all here today. Thanks, really, Julie, Kelly, and Marty, for all the work you do at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. We're big fans. We, of course, love all the applied research that you do and how useful it is to folks on the ground. Here at the University of Minnesota, I think many of you know we've been doing research around the brain gain. We've been documenting people who have been moving into our rural communities and really since the 1970s have been reinvigorating and diversifying our economy, our demography, our social life. And so we received a grant from the National Institute for of Food and Agriculture. And let me start this here. And it was a 3-year grant really to convene our initiatives, and we've got a number of initiatives here across the state. I know Dawn Hegland is here on this call. She was an early part of the work that we did and really supported the efforts for us to not just poll these and survey these newcomers, but to ask more questions about them. And what does it mean then in terms of like, you know, a tight labor market? Again, if we're in it, like there was a world before COVID and before coronavirus here, and in this world just 3.5 months ago, we had a very tight labor market. So in a very tight labor market, labor has a lot of power to choose where they want to live across the state. So it was very timely for this grant. We call it the Rural Newcomer Survey. It's a rural workforce and entrepreneur recruitment and retention project. So we started by, again, building upon the research of the brain gain that we had done earlier that showed overwhelmingly people were choosing to move to small towns for a simpler pace of life, for safety and security, and for the low cost of housing. And it was really in this schema that we called this the brain gain, because it counters that negative narrative around the brain drain. And while we may have 18-year-olds that are choosing to leave our small towns after graduation, at the same time, we've got people in their 30s, 40s, and many times 50s moving in, choosing to move into our rural communities. So in this study that we conducted last year, we've got our sampling area was 20 of our 87 counties in the state. We wanted to provide a mix because there are many different rurals across the state. We've got micropolitan, we've got recreational, we've got isolated, you know, prairie counties too. So we wanted also a geographic cluster. So we surveyed, we obtained a database of all the movers in these counties. And if, in the case that the movers were there was more than 1,200 movers, we received a random sample of those. And then we sent out an invitation to complete an online survey. And at the same time, we followed that up with a paper survey to those households. And in the return here, we had roughly 1,600 surveys that were returned. And when we split those apart, some were recent movers, and we're defining recent as those that move between 1 to 5 years. Some were at 6.5, some were at 20, because the data is only as good as the data that they gather from InfoUSA. But at the same time, we had some folks who moved less than a year ago, and we weren't really interested in their perspective yet. So we geared this at people who had moved 1 to 5 years. So that left us with this sample of 1,610, or sorry, 1,1218. There were 1,610 in the first cut. Then we had two different groups, and we wanted to break this. Our primary purpose for this grant was looking at workforce age 20 to 60. So within that, that's going to be the kind of review we're going to do today is this workforce age. But you'll notice that we ended up with a lot of folks that were primarily older. So we actually ended up with a really great kind of retiree database too, or end of, kind of career and retiree database, which will warrant further discussion, but we're not there yet. So within this group of workforce movers, we had some folks that moved to a new zip code, that i.e. They came from a long distance, and some people that moved within a zip code. So those were our short-term travelers. And then of those that moved into a new zip code, some moved for a job, some did not move for a job, and some did not respond. So within the survey, which was not a short survey, so of course that impacts response rates too, but we asked questions in these key areas. Number one, move factors. Why did you make the move? And those were only asked of people that moved to a new zip code. Generally, when people are moving within a zip code, these factors did not weigh nearly as highly. So really, these banks of questions were not asked of people that moved within the same zip code. Then we asked people to rate their community, to identify how often did they visit the assets in their region. The fourth was how often they're engaged in community events and activities. And then finally, what are some economic and household demographics that we've got in this population. So within the workforce respondents, we had 618 responses that covered 1,780 household members within those households. Roughly one third of those movers are long distance movers, are short distance movers versus long distance. So again, 2/3 of folks are coming from a longer distance to that zip code. Just a quarter of the household had members that lived in the community before. So either they or their partner or family members had grown up, and moved away and come back. Those we call the returnees, while others are true transplants. Really 3/4 of people moving into our rural communities are not from there. They may be from a nearby county, but we really didn't ask about that. We asked about living in this community before. The next question, we had asked a question geared solely toward those that have received a job offer or those that move solely for a job. So really, when you're moving solely for a job, you've got less choice in terms of region across the state that you can move to. What we found here was 31% of respondents had moved because of a job or a job offer. And within these workforce household respondents, just about half of these households have kids. I think the kids' households are easier to see, right? You can see them in your school district, or hey, there's a new kid in my kid's class, so they must have new parents in town. Well, just like to remind you that a lot of times for every household that you see that's got kids, there's going to be another now that doesn't. And they may be a little bit more transparent in terms of what we see in our community. Rural Minnesota here, we're outside of the regional centers. We're still overwhelmingly white. We have modified and added to our processes here to gather data on this by really focusing on focus groups within the Somali, Hispanic, and I think there was another group of folks that we're going to have focus groups in. I don't remember at the moment, but that's kind of been put on pause. We're reinvigorating these. We've done some of the focus groups, but not all of them. But those who have responded to this survey were overwhelmingly white. We did have a good mix between male and female respondents. 92% of those were employed, and 60% of these new workforce movers had a bachelor's degree or higher. Regarding the household, the average household size of these workforce movers was 3.0. 68% of those were married, another 8% were cohabitating, and 11% were not married. We did have a good percentage, a higher than we would expect to find percentage of people that were divorced or separated. And you'll see the size of the household there on the left side. Years in community, 1 to 2, we had a pretty good split, got a little bit smaller. So we went from, 34% of our respondents, and the responses you'll see here today are from households that have been in the community between 1 to 2 years. 2 to 3 years, 28%, and on down the line. Again, years and how long did they spend in their previous community? We have all respondents and then our workforce respondents kind of split out here. And again, workforce respondents tend to be geared toward a shorter time in their previous communities, where now when we include all respondents, we've got a lot more retirees again. So those retirees may have been in their previous community for 20, 30 years, and now they're choosing to move to a different community for retirement reasons. So let's look at factors of why people made the move. We're only looking at those who moved to a new zip code. And the question here is, when you chose to move to this community, how important were each of the following factors for your household? So we are only going to look at people who had a preference. So if people say they, it didn't matter one way or another, we're not interested in looking at those. We will have kind of all this detailed in our full report that'll be published in the near future. So really what we see here is move factors with a preference. 71% of respondents that had a preference for factors when they moved said they wanted to take advantage of a slower pace of life. This parallels our earlier results. Live closer to relatives, find a less congested place to live. And here now we get into cost of living, right? To find a lower priced housing. That was the third top reason in our earlier studies, still in the top 5. So then we get into safety and security, to live in a smaller community, to find a lower cost of living. 65% of respondents said they wanted to lower their cost of living. And that became a factor, either important or very important in their decision to move to this rural community. Now, when we kind of break these apart, let's just look at the people who had said, I only move for a job. Or solely move for a job. And of course, when you move for a job, you're going to say you move for a job. But getting in more nuance here is what were some of the characteristics of that job? What we found is that they wanted to find a job that better matches their skills. And so this actually told us really good news. When you see kind of all these work factors here, this tells us that people aren't taking a step down necessarily to find a job in a rural community. While the wages may be lower, they may actually be, matching or increasing the demands upon their talents and their skill sets. So we also want to have folks that are finding a job that allows a better work-life balance. Because, when we think of cost of living, one thing that's very hard to document is time. When we think of time in terms of a cost. So here we get this work-life balance. It kind of shows up in our top features: to find a better job for my spouse or partner. So you can look at many of these in more detail. We're not going to spend the whole time going kind of piece by piece here, but as you revisit or review this PowerPoint in the future or this presentation, you can take care to look at these with more clarity. So now when we look at these move factors, folks that moved and kind of how these factors ranked. So overall, for all respondents, how did they rank of workforce movers? But then the differentials between people that moved for a job and people that did not move primarily for a job. And there were some differentials in how they ranked and how they chose amenities to find, to find lower priced housing, to find a safer place to live, find a less congested place to live, started to move up. Now, we also had a lot of kind of open-ended questions, which were fascinating. We're going to do a lot more qualitative analysis on this, but we just like to put a few things that we had found in here. I think it's interesting to get to lift up the narrative, because one thing that we had found is many respondents were very happy to actually have an opportunity to share. Like, hey, we love it here, and we don't have the results on our full open-ended question. This was more about move factors, but the full open-ended question, we had a lot of people who were very happy to be able to share like these positive stories about why they made the move, as well as some of the complaints they had about, what does Minnesota nice really mean, and how does that play out in our small towns. So then we asked banking questions around community ratings. And here we looked at those that agree or strongly agree, and the sum of those that disagree or strongly disagree. And overwhelmingly, over 90% of respondents felt responded that they felt safe in this community. They're satisfied with living in the community. They trust the people. The schools are of high quality. I repeatedly get questions about differentials between, school districts that are quote unquote good and not so good school districts. What we found continually is that there were very few differentials. It was more about the opportunity to have their kids go to a rural school, much less the differentials between one rural school, how that differed from another rural school. So satisfaction with healthcare, natural amenities and recreational opportunities. Then we had some questions about, future looking. 5 years from now, I will more likely live in this community. And that kind of goes into other factors that we'll look at that can impinge upon their, how well are they engaged? Do the community feel welcoming? We did have a really directed question at that. The community is welcoming of new residents. I think it's like 77% of respondents indicated that the community is welcoming of new residents. We'll look at some of this in a little bit more detail. And now we kind of look at some of the other, where people disagreed with some of these statements. Satisfaction with broadband options in this community. And while we do have some communities that have really great fiber to the farm, Western Minnesota, we've got Federated that does some really great work, other co-ops across the state that we have fiber. We certainly do have other parts of the state that do not have opportunities for broadband. And we're very blessed and lucky here to have the Office of Broadband Development here in Minnesota, that we've been supporting and capitalizing many of these efforts to bring broadband to our rural communities. And now, again, we're seeing a lot of people wanting to move to our rural communities, and ensuring that we've got that infrastructure in place becomes even more important. We look at a question about easy to find housing. So those of you that have heard me before, I talk a lot about the rural narrative, and a lot of times the rural narrative is one about the doom and gloom and death and dying of our small towns. And then I say, well, if our small towns are all dying, then why can't I find a house to buy? And we see this play out in our results here, that people are actually finding it very difficult to find homes, not just for local movers, but transplants trying to move in the community. And then we've got kind of optimism or pessimism around the economy over the next 5 years. And again, these are pre-COVID related questions about qualities around economic opportunity in region, the quality of the housing. So we've definitely identified areas that we have to work on across our regions. So now just getting at the welcoming question, the community is welcoming. What percentage of respondents are saying that they're going to live here in 5 years? If they stated that the community is welcoming, very welcoming, 86% of those respondents said, yeah, I think I could be here in 5 years. This kind of speculative basis. Where if you disagreed that the community was welcoming, you had less than half of a chance that you thought you were going to be living there in 5 years. So I think this raises really good questions about how welcoming is our community. What do we currently do? How do we do it? It's very difficult. We don't have welcome wagons anymore like we used to, but here in Minnesota, we've got a number of resident recruitment initiatives. Many of you all are represented here on this call that have been working on these welcoming atmospheres in our rural communities. So now we've got asset visitations. This was a very small bank of questions about how often, we get out and play and recreate in the community. And overall, like 82% of households are saying that they're going to the lakes and other bodies of water. 86% are going to the parks. We did not see very large differentials outside of campgrounds, which overall was fairly low anyway, in terms of whether or not people attended those items in the region. Now, when we differentiate between local movers and long distance movers, again, not large differentials outside of camping. We did see sporting events. People who were local movers tended to go to more, I would expect, high school sporting events in the region than folks who came in from the outside. So the second to last bank of questions here we got is around community engagement. And these are questions around how often have you worked on a community or regional project? How often have you attended a meeting to discuss town or school affairs, right? And so we've got a lot of folks who said never, right? Like I never worked on a community project. So this provides avenues for us to kind of examine characteristics of the population and who shows up at meetings, who shows up to volunteer. We're seeing overall about 30%, 32% of our respondents have never volunteered in the community. 28% have never attended religious services, and there are some crosscuts you can make there in terms of some differences in how people engage that. But you see how kind of dichotomous this continuum is. Either you never went to church or you almost always went to church. So there's very few in between here. Where in terms of like media and public settings to socialize, we kind of ran across the middle here. So what I'm interested in here is kind of when you look through those questions here, what's more important for me is not how often they did these things, but another way to look at this is I'm not going to feel bad because somebody didn't work on a regional project every week. That when you work on a regional project, you could do that 1 or 2 times a year, and that's helping to accomplish a regional goal. So I want to look at just those respondents who had said never. So I had never worked on a community or regional project. Overall, 52% of respondents had never worked on a project. There are some differentials. Returnees, people who this was somewhat confusing. Returnees tended to work less on regional or community projects than people who were coming in from the outside. If you're coming in from the outside, transplants, you're less likely to attend a public meeting or discuss town or school affairs. And again, religious services tended to be the largest differential that we found. And that is, if you're a transplant, you're less likely to go to church, where if you're a returnee, you're probably more likely to go to church and attend religious services in some way. So the last piece here is very exciting. And this is about economic characteristics. And again, we're not going to pretend like this is everybody that's moved in. This is a sample that is a representative of those that we've sampled. So we use these characteristics to identify who we're missing and who we're not including in this. But what we do find is that these households, about 75% have a household. Again, this is household. So if you've got two income, they're being put together here, right? 75% of households are making $50,000 or more. 82% of our respondents had owned their home. 92% were employed. I mentioned this earlier. And commute times, we had a commute time question here. And while in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, the average commute time is 26 minutes, we're finding that just a few minutes more than that, like only 10% of our respondents are saying they commute more than 30 minutes or more. So I think, we tend to not just live and work and shop and play in one town, but even when we do work in regional centers, that commute time is not very long. And we see here that 80%, right? 80% of our rural workforce movers are commuting 20 minutes or less. So I think these are again, when we measure time as a cost, like we've got a distinct advantage here in terms of making a case for moving to rural Minnesota to save that amount of time. There was just an interview done in a news piece that talked about this. It was a veterinarian, and she said, boy, I can really go from being done with work to getting home, and my husband gets home and we jump on and we hook up the boat and we're on the lake in like 15 minutes from when I leave my office to be on the lake. So I think there's a lot of stories to help kind of backfill this data here. So economic characteristics, again, moving for a job. If you're coming in, if you're returning to the community, you're less likely to say that you're moving solely for a job. And if you're returning, you may be doing so more for family reasons and other characteristics. But if you're a transplant, you're more likely to be moving solely for a job. Again, if you're older, you are less likely to move solely for a job. Again, you're younger, you're probably trying to get your career going and establish your career path and some experience. So you're more likely to follow a job around. But as you age, quality of life kind of takes over in your economic decision-making and really where you decide to place your residence. One of the more exciting pieces we have here is this. 14% of respondents said they currently telecommute or work remotely for a company not located in the region. That doesn't mean that this is their sole job, but that means they have a component of their life that involves telecommuting. 14% of respondents and 16% of their spouses are telecommuting. 18% of respondents currently own a business. We did ask generally what kind of occupation they had, but we didn't ask whether this was a sole proprietorship or a 500 employee business, right? Well, we found of those that do own a business, 36% said they took over the already existing business, while 2/3 really created a business. And this is fascinating news to say that, you're not an exception when you are successful in rural Minnesota. Like you can be the rule here, right? We've got people going out and creating businesses every day. We've got people going out, we've studied this within the University of Minnesota Extension 2 around succession planning. We have a large proportion of our current business owners that are age 60 and older. And how are we going to turn these over in a reasonable way? This is one way, recruiting people in to help purchase and manage these already existing businesses. And at the same time, this isn't coming in and taking care of a dying business. Like, these businesses have managed to make it through the recessions that we've had. These businesses right now are stronger than ever. They tend to increase their sales base, increase the number of employees, and increase their product base after they make this transition. And then again, 10% own a farm, but in farming, it's kind of the other way. You don't just walk out and start a new farm operation these days. 70% of these respondents said they purchased an already existing farm, while just 30% said that they created. So down the road here, we got a bunch of different research to do. This is kind of our outcome for our NIFA grant. But now, because of the NIFA grant, we've got a really great data set. So we've got a brain gain specific analysis to do. This is just looking at 30 to 50-year-olds. We've also got an end of career / retiree analysis that we can do out of this data set. We look at household connections to family. So really, for those that move solely for family, what are some of the other characteristics that kind of play into the decision to make them move? What about households that aren't linked? Meaning I didn't move for family. I don't know anybody there. I'm not from there. I am really brand new. What are characteristics of them? Or what about folks that are going through divorce? We saw a lot of open-ended questions around, I've got a fresh start in this community because of my divorce. I really feel like this was the best opportunity for me. So we've also got down the road analysis around just the telecommuters and remote work folks. as well as, what about people that identify the community as welcoming? Or what are characteristics of communities that are identified as being challenged with being welcoming, right? And then what are qualities of engaged residents? So those residents that, what if you've got a transplant that moves in as wholly engaged? I mean, what are characteristics of households like that? And then we've got the final kind of piece down the road here is around housing and commuting and the interrelationship between the two. So again, I kind of went through this fairly quickly, but we'll have more published pieces coming out. We'll have these pieces on our Brain Gain website. Just again, want to thank the Center for Rural Policy and Development for providing an opportunity for us to share all this here today. And yeah, I think I will just turn it back to you, Kelly. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. That was the first time I got to see a lot of that data, so that was really cool. So I know we got a few questions here, and Marnie, in the meantime, I know you've been kind of looking at them. We're going to kind of have you ask those. We have questions both in the chat and in the Q&A. So Marnie, if you want to go ahead and fire away.
Sure, you bet. The first question we have here is for Ben, actually, and it's for the community members who were less engaged in projects, church, etc. Were they more likely to be the ones who didn't rate their satisfaction with their community as high, or say they would be there in 5 years? That seems to be a theme in this questioner's community. The more engaged someone is there, the more likely they are to be living there. So do you have any data on that?
We don't, but we have the same inclination, right? I mean, it leads us to actually want to study the characteristics of these engaged residents, and really then kind of we take a step back and like, how does your community currently welcome new people in, and how do they currently invite people to be engaged in different groups? We want to get past, I would say, the warm body approach that like, oh, you're new in town, hey, ready to sit on my board? Like, that's probably the worst thing you can do, right? It is like, how do you, it's like we're flipping burgers for the firemen on Friday night. Do you want to help us out? So it is like very much these kind of small requests. And I'll just say Otter Tail County, Eric Osberg's he's the Otter Tail County Rural Rebound Initiative Coordinator, and he has what they call a grab-a-bite program. And it is what ambassadors in every one of the small towns, when they hear about a new resident, they take that newcomer out for a meal. And it is not there to be hounded about, getting involved. It is just a point of contact and that one little affirmation that you are welcomed here. We see you. Thank you for coming. So great question. Don't have the answer yet, but look forward. Thanks.
Great. Okay. The next one is for Kelly. Is there a concern that there don't seem to be counties on the map where wages exceed the family living costs?
Yeah, so I know probably when I was giving that presentation, there's a lot of excitement about, look how great rural Minnesota is, or, look at how, we rank as far as competitiveness in our wages. And there's a lot more nuance there too. And you'll see that in our report that, part of the usefulness of looking at wages with cost of living isn't only about promoting your region to people that don't live there, but also about having our economic development organizations have good conversations with their employers in their region to say, hey, you've been using the low cost of living as an argument to continue to pay lower wages, but that isn't meeting reality right here according to the data. And so, yeah, I think that is a concern. That should be a concern for the local economic development organizations. And I hope this kind of information, this data can help finally piece some of that puzzle together, because I think there always has been this, you pay pretty low wages and then the employer saying, yeah, but it's pretty cheap to live here. So now we kind of have something a little bit more concrete, or at least a foundation to have that conversation, which is incredibly important.
Okay, good. Next question. How does this change? I believe this is about the cost of living index and the data. How does this change if you have 3 kids or more than one, basically? How much does it add on apparently to the cost of living?
Right. So that was something, I didn't go too far into the weeds on looking at how much the changes impact metropolitan versus rural areas when you start tacking on more kids. I will say the methodology behind DEED's cost of living calculator and the way they do it is that if you choose 1 kid, the kid's a male between the ages of something. If you choose 2 kids, the second one's a female between the ages of something. They kind of have this this methodology down where the number of kids you're choosing, they're trying to take in a lot of different variables to try and give you the best average that they can. I would say that I wouldn't, just from my gut perspective and what I've seen from the data, to there be a reason why if you had one kid in greater Minnesota, you had a 3-person household with one kid in greater Minnesota, and for that occupation, that median wage makes up, let's say, 120%, and it only makes up 100% in Twin Cities. I would see no reason why if you added on 2 more kids, so you had 3 kids, and all of a sudden it meets only 90% of the cost of living in greater Minnesota, why the Twin Cities would continue to stay 100% or 90%. I would assume that would go down just as much as well. But again, I would have to dig into more details, which you can do now if you want to look at our website and kind of dig around a little bit as well.
Okay. Next question. This could be for either of you. How does the shortage of childcare affect people moving to rural Minnesota? Is it an influence, or do they?
I'll let you take that one, Ben.
Well, yeah, it's terrible. I mean, in terms of like right now, even before that, I think housing shortages kind of limit people moving before they even get to the childcare piece. I know, for example, we've had a lot of stories in northern Minnesota about, no birthing centers and whatnot. So how do we ensure that we provide that kind of infrastructure of childcare? I mean, there has never not been a childcare shortage. I mean, there has always consistently been a childcare shortage. Right now, it's probably at one of the worst places we've ever had. And so I think it's not necessarily a push away, but it's going to be hard to pull people in when we've got this narrative of childcare shortage. So, but we had found, just FYI, in a lot of the newcomer studies we've done, people aren't moving into our rural communities until the kids are in like 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. So this is a little bit of a nuance in terms of newcomer survey. They're not always having the kids out here. I mean, we know our birth rate has been going down, but we still have people moving in. And you watch our school enrollments, and if you watch a cohort growth from kindergarten to 1st to 2nd to 3rd, the cohorts get bigger in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. So I think it's twofold. One is the people moving in generally have kids that are already in school of those influx, but you've already got existing residents are looking to have kids, and they may have a network in place already of like, hey, I know Jan is looking to quit doing daycare next year, so how can I ensure that I'm going to have some stability next year with my kids? So I think there's a lot of conversations to be had about this, but I think some people don't know how bad it is until they start looking, after they already make the move, or after they've already been there for a year and a half. I'm like, hey, we're gonna have kids. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't find anywhere to take them. And so I think broadband kind of plays into that a little bit too. It's not necessarily something that's pulling you in, but could push you away once you're there.
Yeah, I will say with the cost of living stuff, this is a great question because I think it brings up an interesting, I would say, paradox in the whole thing. We have categories such as housing and childcare, which are categorized as being significantly cheaper in the Twin Cities, but also is that part of the cause of why we can't have more childcare and why we don't have more housing, right? If people were willing to pay more rent, we could probably develop more housing. If people were willing to pay more for childcare, it might entice more people to join the healthcare or the childcare industry. So I think that's a really interesting element to all of this, is that, yeah, it's cheaper to live out here, but there might be a different price to pay in terms of availability. And so there might be a little bit more of a balance there that needs to be said, to be like, okay, you know what, we can pay a little more in housing or a little bit more in childcare if that means there's more availability. So I think that's a really interesting conversation for again, our economic development organizations to have.
Okay, great. This question was from early on. This is about the cost of living data. What does this data mean for southeastern Minnesota, in particular Rochester, Olmsted County area?
Yeah, good question. I guess I don't, off the top of my head, I can't rattle off too many numbers because I didn't look too deep into that. But I would assume what I do remember is that southeastern portion, even Olmsted County, the cost of living there being a little bit higher than its surrounding kind of more rural counties, but still lower than it is in the 7-county metro, while at the same time the wages always consistently in that region being either the 2nd highest or the 3rd highest among all of the state. And so from what I looked at, particularly among healthcare occupations, I always remember the Southeast Minnesota, the median wages for those occupations making up the highest percentage of cost of living to live there. And so I think for many occupations, particularly, like I said, healthcare, it looks pretty promising, and it could be really interesting to dig into that a little bit deeper.
Okay, great. Here's another one. Speak to the distance that people travel to work. So I guess that could be for either of you.
Yeah, I call it live in the middle of everywhere. You live in the middle of everywhere. You place your home in the middle of all the places that you work and shop and play. We haven't, small towns haven't been one-stop shop since like 1880. Yeah, like when you would never go outside of it, really. We are very mobile. We take cars lots of different places. I do this exercise called living in the middle of everywhere. Yeah, people put a star where they live and an X where they work, and it's not always the same town. And then you draw kind of a boundary around how far do you go out to shop and eat out? Because Kelly's from Hancock, but when I lived in Hancock, I didn't want to eat at Buddy's Bar and Grill every time I ate out. I wanted, we've got places all over Benson. That's some great Mexican. You've got all these places. So what we have found is that people situate their homes in the middle of all these opportunities: recreational, social, economic, shopping, all of these things. So, again, people are going to commute up to 20, 30 minutes away for work, a lot of times to regional centers or to another town. And then we've got these distances that people are willing to travel up to 45 minutes to an hour to shop and eat out. And then you've got people going out to play and recreate. It's hours. So, it really, for me, emphasizes regional living, that our towns and small towns should not be competing with each other. They should be complementing each other. And I mean that both ways. Not just saying nice things about your neighbors, but finding ways that you complement your activities. So if I'm going to Starbucks for some horse event there, some equestrian event, that there's going to be some other related activities in the region that we can build upon. So it's really complement your neighbors is kind of my line through this.
Okay, great. And what about food access in rural Minnesota?
Well, so I know I can talk a little bit about the cost of living on that. That was one category in which, if you broke it down by county, there were counties, particularly out in west central Minnesota, where the grocery stores are a little bit more scattered, a little bit more distantly from each other, where the cost of food ended up being higher than in the 7-county metro, the monthly cost of food. And that was largely due to, smaller grocery store chains are going to have to charge a little bit more money just due to distribution challenges and not having the ability to purchase in high quantities, thus getting it for lower costs. The distance traveled for the food. And so that was typically where you saw, that was the category in which you would see some rural counties being greater expense. But that's about all I can speak to. I know the University of Minnesota Extension, I forget what program from you guys, but you guys specifically look at grocery stores and grocery store vitality in rural Minnesota. Is that correct, Ben?
Oops, sorry. The regional partnerships too. The University of Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. They're under the umbrella of Extension here. They've been doing a lot of work on food-related activities. Ryan Pesch within our shop in Community Vitality has done a lot of work also on the impact of local groceries and impact of local shopping. So yeah, we've got a lot of folks that are well known in doing work in this area. That if you want connections with these folks, let us know.
Ben, do you know, just a little side note, with the pandemic COVID-19 happening, there's been some news articles coming out about how local grocery stores are doing better than ever just because people are shopping a little more locally than they used to. Is there going to be any follow-up research on that by your guys' shop that you know of or anything?
I am not sure. I expect we will be coming out of this, not just like local grocery, but local meat processors. We've had unprecedented demand anecdotally, but we're researchers, so I'm hesitant to make any statements here.
Sure, great. Okay.
Okay, and one last question. Is there a systematic change that could be considered for childcare licensing requirements, thinking outside the box, etc.? Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, Marnie, you're my childcare person. You go ahead, Marnie. You know way more about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, this is the $64,000 question, is what can we do to solve this basic market failure that's going on with childcare right now? We can't providers can't seem to charge enough to cover their costs and actually still keep it affordable for families. And so, you know, is there a systemic change? I think that's what everybody's trying to figure out. We're going to be reviewing some of the change, well, the major legislation that the legislature approved last year, and seeing what they did, and if that has had any effect yet, even though it's a little sooner, or a little soon. And but we will continue to be, you know, looking for best practices and seeing if there is some kind of a solution. This is something that really hasn't been worked on very hard anywhere. I shouldn't say very hard, but it's like there are no solutions coming out of any place systematically yet. So we're hoping that with attention that we can figure out, you know, how to solve this problem. And let's see, I think that's all the questions I'm seeing here.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's it, everybody. Julie, did you want to end it? And just want to thanks again, Ben. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks you guys so much. We really value our partnership with University of Minnesota Extension. We have a great partnership with them, and it's great that we can share resources. And thank you to everyone who participated. Please be looking for more webinars coming up in the future. We have more research coming out all the time, and so we're going to continue to do these webinars. And hopefully someday when we can all get together again, we might actually get to see everyone in person. So thank you all. Thank you everyone for participating. Also, don't forget to go on our website, and you'll be able to go and play in there with the Atlas and with that cost of living tool. So make sure you go in there, and all of this information is available for you and anybody across the state, the country, the world to use for free. And yes, thank you, Ben. This recording will be available on YouTube probably next week. We'll see how quick we can get it edited and formatted, but it will be on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much to everyone for participating. Have a great day.